Turning this evening to the book of the prophet Isaiah, chapter 5 and verse 1. Isaiah chapter 5, verse 1. Now will I sing to my well-beloved a song of my beloved touching his vineyard. My beloved hath a vineyard in a very fruitful hill. And we shall be considering the 6 features of mankind under the 6 woes set before us in this quite astonishing Hebrew poem. The vineyard parable and the 6 woes of mankind. Now, it's an extraordinary analysis of human behaviour. In fact, we turn, say, to the letter to the Romans, chapters 1 and chapter 2. We see passages there where human behaviour is analysed and presented. And one of the most exhaustive sin lists of the Apostle Paul occurs there. But there's nothing like the detail. This is, of course, no criticism of the inspired epistle of Paul to the Romans, but there's nothing like the detail provided there that is provided here. And this sometimes is the case in the Old Testament. You will find passages that are a lot fuller and a lot more complete in teaching the depths of a doctrinal position and the nuances, sometimes in the Old Testament, as for example with the offerings of the book of Leviticus, where you find the different aspects of the suffering of Christ on Calvary expounded far more fully than you do anywhere in the New Testament. And while we're accustomed to saying, and it's broadly true, that all the light is in the New Testament and it brings to life and light the Old Testament, there are examples where it operates the other way around. And God has been pleased to reveal through prophets of old a degree of detail which is not repeated in the New Testament. And here, in this 5th chapter of Isaiah, you have a classic example of this. This is so profound and so remarkable. It's a message for Judah, well, for all Israel. It's a message for the New Testament church. It's a message for the whole world. Now, first of all, in the first portion of the chapter, the prophet Isaiah is said to adopt the position of a folk singer to present his opening sentences, or if not a singer, because he doesn't sing, a poet. And he opens up with the vineyard parable. And here in verse 5 in chapter 1, we just come into the passage, now will I sing to my well-beloved, and as the passage goes on, that's clearly the Lord himself. Now will I sing to the Lord, if you like, a song of my beloved, it's given to him, touching his vineyard. My well-beloved owns a vineyard in a very fruitful hill. It's quite a passage. A horn-shaped hill is the Hebrew, the original, and the idea behind that is this vineyard is so perfect. It's situated in a kind of horseshoe-shaped hill so that it always has the sun. It has the full sweep of what we would call here a south light. It's perfect for warmth and position. Even the very shape of the land which is owned is perfect for its purpose. And then verse 2, and he fenced it. But a few verses later, we're told there was a double fence. There was a thick hedge, and there was also a wall of stones. The land is very stony. The stones were gathered out to make it fit to be cultivated, and they were used for a wall. So there was a wall and a hedge. He fenced it so carefully to keep out the beasts, the animals, any kind of marauder who would trample the ground, gathered out the stones thereof. This vineyard had every opportunity to succeed, and planted it with the choicest vine. We can only guess at the varieties that might have been available, but the very best was selected, procured, and planted, and built a tower in the midst of it to house watchmen, to carefully nurture it and keep watch over it. Also in expectation made a winepress therein. And he looked, or waited, could be an equally good translation. He looked, he waited, that it should bring forth grapes, and it brought forth wild grapes. And there's a great deal of opinion which thinks that the Hebrew should be translated smelling grapes, rotting grapes. Translators tend to go for wild grapes, but the root of the word is the verb to smell. Grapes which, for one reason or another, were unfit for use or consumption. Tremendous disappointment. And immediately, well, the parable for the moment is closed. And verse 3, the ground shifts a little. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge, I pray you, betwixt me and my vineyard. God summons them to stand in judgment. Of course, they are the people who are being described, but they don't know that yet. They're just called upon to judge between God and this vineyard in the parable. Verse 4, and the reasoning. What could have been done more to my vineyard? How he cared for it, the owner, and provided for it. What could I have done more that I have not done in it? Wherefore, when I looked that it should bring forth grapes, brought it forth wild grapes, or bad or smelling grapes, barely fit for animals. The environment was perfect. The degree of instruction that was given to the church of old, because that's what the vineyard stands for, it turns out. The evidences they were given of the power of God and his presence with them. They were delivered out of Egypt. They were brought through miracles and wonders. They were given revelation. They didn't have to use their own judgment for life and its great issues. They were given examples like Moses and others. They were given personally a conscience, a lively conscience. They were given a system of worship, a mind, power of reason, much beauty and love from God. And this is really the application of this. What could have been done more? On what basis did Israel go wrong? Why did they rebel against their God? So the summons is given, the invitation to judge, but there's no reply. From verse 4 to verse 5, the people are not said to make any reply. There's only sullen silence. There's nothing that can be said. Same with us, of course. And we're brought to see this at conversion. What more could God have done? Planted us in the human race with special gifts, 1,000 miles higher than the animals, with unique abilities, given us everything we needed. And yet we don't want him. And we're against him. And we vilify him and oppose him. What's the issue, says God? What more could I have done for you that I have not already done? And verse 5, and now go to, I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. And so here's the word of prophecy. I will take away the hedge thereof, and it shall be eaten up, and break down the wall thereof. There's the double protection. What's going to happen? Well, they'll be open to invasion, and they were repeatedly open to paganism and idolatry. They'll be exposed to these things. It will happen to Israel. It'll happen to the church in New Testament times. If churches swerve away from God, they'll be diminished and ruined. It'll happen to all mankind at the end of time. So man will be exposed to the consequences of his rejection of God. Verse 6, I will lay it waste by invasion sometimes, by famine sometimes. It shall not be pruned nor digged. There'll be no word of conviction. You can apply these things as you go. There'll be no conversions. There'll be no holding back of false teaching. There'll come up briars and thorns. Every kind of lie will flourish to take people from the truth. I will also command the clouds that they rain, no rain upon it. There'll be no blessing, no power from God. And then if they haven't got it already, verse 7 makes the direct application. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the mead of Judah his pleasant plant. And he looked for judgment, but behold oppression. Now that's part of the parable, as it were. He looked to see justice and found only complete oppression in the land. And the application for righteousness. That's what he was really looking for. Righteousness. But behold, a cry. How interesting. A cry. What was the cry that the Lord is said to hear? Our natural inclination will be to say, well, it's something to do with that lack of judgment and that oppression. It's surely the people crying out in pain. But it's probably not that. It's linked with the next verse. Behold, a cry. And then Isaiah makes the cry. Woe unto them. The cry is the very gasp of Almighty God. It is the exclamation which follows, in all probability, and there will be 6 of them. Woe. It's a simple term. Why? As you probably know, it comes from an even shorter exclamation. Oh! An exclamation of astonishment, or of pain, or ah! An exclamation of hurt or harm. And the word woe is just a slight expansion of that in the Hebrew. It's an exclamation of amazement, astonishment, pain, and woe. What a sight! Israel rejecting the one who had done so much for her. Humanity rejecting the one who gives so much. And the prophet then takes up that exclamation in its expanded form under 6 headings. And here from verse 8 are the 6 woes that summarize all of human behavior. And it's perfectly done. You could study these for hours. How symmetrical they are, how balanced they are, how all-encompassing they are. This is by inspiration. If it hadn't been by inspiration, Isaiah would have spent weeks composing this and probably not come up with anything so perfect. Verse 8, the first woe, materialism. Covetousness, if you like, but materialism. Woe unto them that join house to house, that lay field to field, till there be no place that they may be placed alone in the midst of the earth. The first of 6 descriptions of all human behavior is materialism, substituting God by things, by flesh, by what you can see and have and boast of and be proud of yourself for having achieved or possessed. Entire materialism. The great aim of mankind, expressing his rebellion against God. Some may look at this passage and they may see it as something which merely describes Israel. Oh, they'll say, the people of that time were guilty of this. The people of that time were guilty of that. That's very short-sighted. This is announced very plainly, first of all, as a parable. It is obviously a series of analogies for all mankind, for Israel, for what Israel typifies. Israel typifies both the whole of mankind or the elect church of God in various applications in the scripture. And so what we're reading here is not just about Israel, it's about us. It's about all mankind's human characteristics. And the first is this materialism. Woe unto them that join house to house. Now the old writers were shrewd to observe that this was actually very difficult in Israel, to join house to house. There was an insurmountable problem which prevented you from buying what today you'd call the whole terrace or the whole row. You simply couldn't do it in those days because property changed hands largely by inheritance, and everyone had their portion, their small holding, their lot. Next door wasn't on the open market. It could only be inherited by the heirs of that family and their heirs and their heirs. So how do you acquire neighbouring properties? In Judah, in Jerusalem, can't be done. The very law of Moses is against it. But they had a way round it, the experts tell us. And the way round it was this. You wanted your neighbour's villa or property or land so that you could make a show. You could have a whole row of them, detached, beautiful houses, and people would say that's so-and-so's row, or rows, or streets, or neighbourhood. It was for show, for pride. But how did you do it? Well, you approached the person who owned the place and you made him an offer, but he'd have to adopt you. Yes, he'd have to legally adopt you in a sort of adoption of convenience so that he could then make over, even before his death, the house to you as a legitimate future heir. You could do that in advance of time, apparently. What a cumbersome performance. Then once he'd got it, he'd be de-adopted, or whatever the term is, and so on until he'd engulfed an entire street. What an elaborate and expensive performance just to be seen to own the whole row. It's materialism and pride that's in view. This establishes me, this great hunger for possessions, to revel in them, to be seen to have them, or to have them for security. I don't believe in God. I don't believe in eternity. My earthly security is everything. This is human idolatry, the alternative to God. And it's the first of the great 6 features of all mankind. Everybody who isn't saved is within their heart a materialist and an idolater and a covetous person and a proud person. It's humiliating. We resent it to hear it, but it's the truth. This is God's analysis of human beings. Why God is so angry with the human race. I mustn't spend too much time with each of these quite distinctive features. Woe unto them that join house to house, that lay field to field, whatever it costs, whatever lengths they have to go to, that there be no place that wherever you look, they own it. They're great. They're major people. Verse 9, in mine ears, said the Lord of hosts, of a truth many houses shall be desolate. Now the acquisition of properties is the means of condemning the materialism of man. It may not always be properties, maybe all sorts of other things, but this is selected as the example. But of course, when the Babylonian invasion comes, They've lost it all. When famine comes, they've lost it all. There's no staff for those places. There'll be no yield, verse 10. No produce. When AD 70 comes, well, sadly, the Jewish nation lose everything. Temple, priesthood, privileges, everything. Do things out of pride, eventually we lose them. But I'm just summarizing. That's the first woe that's mentioned. Oh, the materialism and the pride and the covetousness of the human heart. Make sure it doesn't come back in us. We've been saved from that. But the devil's cunning. He was saved maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Maybe you've forgotten how to fight against covetousness or secret idolatry of possessions or looking good for the sake of it in what you own and have. Maybe the devil's stealing it back over you and bringing you back into love with things. Remember, it's the first of the 6 great woes. Well, then we come down very quickly to verse 11, the second woe, and it's the woe of moral corruption. Woe unto them that rise up early in the morning, that they may follow strong drink. I don't know whether that means they rise up early in the morning to get their business done expeditiously and out of the way so that they can get down to their evening or afternoon revelry or whatever it might be as soon as possible, or whether they're actually drinking from the crack of dawn. It's difficult to determine which the passage means, but it's one or the other. Woe unto them, what they're intent on is their pleasure time, and they're turning over all morality. And then it goes on to speak about their inebriation, the things they want, sensation and experiences. And verse 12, the harp and the viol, the tabret and pipe and wine. The tabret would be, in this situation, the tambourine, something like that. And the viol will be a zither. It's really a percussion instrument in Jewish times. The harp, the viol, the tabret and pipe and wine are in their feasts. And where there's wine and rhythm, there's sexual immorality too. But they regard not the work of the Lord, neither consider the operation of his hands. They're people who want to indulge. That's what they live for. And that's what most unsaved people live for, ultimately, to indulge some pleasure, to get down to what life is really about, to get the work, burden and responsibility done and out of the way and get on to what is going to give pleasure. And that urge is in the human race in its rebellion against God. Verse 13, therefore my people are gone into captivity because they have no knowledge, and their honourable men are famished, and their multitude dried up with thirst, and the judgment is described. And there's pride behind it, and everyone will be humbled in verse 15, in due time by the hand of Almighty God. And he shall be vindicated. A little glimpse into the New Testament church in verse 17. But I go on to the third woe in verse 18. Woe unto them that draw iniquity with cords of vanity. And this is the human inclination to rebel for its own sake. It's rather different from the first two. It is the willful rebellion of man against God. And they sin, the members of the human race, even though it's hard to sin. Woe unto them that draw iniquity. The picture is of, well, not animals, but men behaving like animals, as though they're cart horses drawing a cart. And the ropes are ropes of futility, which is what the word vanity here means. Ropes of nothingness. Why? Why so much effort to do anything that God doesn't want and to avoid doing everything that he does want? Why? What lasting satisfaction does it bring? None. What depth of happiness? None. Only fleeting pleasures that last for a moment and cost dearly. So it's completely unfulfilling cords or ropes, and the cart is hard to draw. It's hard to live a life of sin. If only people would think, of course we've got to, in the walk after God, we've got to fight against our sin and strive in righteousness. But even taking account of that, it's a lot happier and it's a lot easier and it's a lot better than living for sin and for lust and for possessions and for earthly satisfaction. It's a lot harder to do that. Woe unto them that are set on rebellion against God, even though, if they think about it, it's the most costly pathway for them. Determined to sin. Rebellion is in us against God. And they make an excuse. We were talking about this only Sunday before last in the morning service, that say, let him make speed and hasten his work, that we may see it, and let the counsel of the Holy One of Israel draw nigh and come, that we may know it. I'll tell you what this amounts to. We will believe in God if he does things our way. So we're talking about the journalist and broadcaster, John Humphreys, and he's interviewing those religious leaders, and he asked the same question of each one in turn. Oh, he said, I visualize parents, and they've got a child dying from cancer, little child. Where is God in that? Where is... I believe in God, said that journalist, if he does things the way I want him to do them. He relieves us of all suffering, all heartache, all tragedy, lets no child die, and so on. Then we'll start to take notice of him on our terms, doing it like we want it, so that we can do as we like, and he will still spoil us. But while we're under his judgment, because we won't have him, and therefore he exposes us to misfortune and tragedy and heartache of our own making, we don't want him. We'll question him. That's exactly what's going on here. That's really the spirit of this passage. This is their excuse, says Isaiah, verse 19, the rebel. Let him make speed and hasten his work, that we may see it, and let the counsel of the Holy One of Israel draw nigh and come to deliver us as a nation and make us comfortable. Then we'll start taking some notice. They won't, of course. Even if God did that extraordinary thing, because this is rebellion. And verse 20 brings us to yet another, and I'm hurrying, and it is the fourth woe. It's the perversion of truth. Woe unto them that call evil good and good evil, that put darkness for light, light for darkness, and so on. You know the passage. Evil is good, they say. We want liberty from all moral standards. We want sexual adventure and doing as we please. We find purity and chastity harmful to the human race. It makes us inhibited, and it gives us all kinds of problems and psychological problems. It's unwanted. We reject it and repudiate it. Why, these things are not evil. They're just outmoded ideas. We should have liberty to express ourselves as we wish, as long as we don't do undue harm to people. We're against law. We're against moral standards. Woe unto them that pervert the truth. and try to do away with the moral law of God and make sin righteousness and criminalize righteousness. Well, dear friends, we're seeing that in our age as never before, as I constantly assert and try to show you. You go back to the 1960s, where even though people were unbelievers, the Christian ethic was still followed. But since that time, there's been the great movement to get rid of Christian morality and to substitute it with our own idea of morality and anti-morality. Well, this is one of the great woes, the fourth. It's always been this tendency for mankind to try to reverse the standards of God, deny the fall, reverse the standards. And then verse 21 brings you to a fifth woe, and that is the exalting of human wisdom. Woe unto them that are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight. And the human race is naturally conceited. Reason, human reason, is greater in its estimation than the revelation of God. That can be ignored. No revealed truth. Even throw out the past if it's inconvenient. If past generations held to certain standards, poor things, they didn't know what they were doing. Get rid of those standards and reverse everything. Ridicule redemption, scorn Christ and prayer, and it even comes into churches. Human wisdom decides what should be done and how we should do it. It's a human problem. But there it is in verse 21, the elevation of human wisdom. And then the sixth woe, which is in verse 22, the collapse of integrity and probity. It's pictured in verse 22 and verse 23. You take the verses together as the judges. In verse 22, it doesn't repeat the earlier comment about wine. It's now talking about the people of verse 23. The woe starts in verse 22. Woe unto them that are mighty, they're valiant people, great people, says the Hebrew, ruling people, mighty to drink wine and men of strength to mingle strong drink. That's really what they're living for. But this is the issue, which justify the wicked for reward and take away the righteousness of the righteous from him. Well, this applies to the judges. It applies to business people. It applies to all leaders. It's describing the collapse of integrity and the amount of corruption that comes into society. What it's saying is that corruption and law is typical of the human race. The law courts, perhaps in our country right now, are almost the last of these areas to be affected. You see corruption in the business world first. We're still trying to get over the corruption of the banks in 2008. Whoever would have thought of that? The deep-dyed corruption of the banks, through and through, affecting such integrity, probity, and yet so deeply corrupt, almost ruined the economy of the Western world by their corruption. And hardly any of them have been brought to justice. It seems that the law courts, which are the illustration here, are in our experience the last to actually fall, or seemingly. But what do I know? But right through industry and in every circle of society and in every little company, there is so much corruption and cheating, even in the professions. And people these days, for years now, never used to be donkeys years ago, but people who are accountants are saying, I'm going to have to move partnerships or companies because of the corruption I'm asked to be involved in and the degree of deception that is allowed and permitted and going on. I've had lawyers say it to me in their practice. All sorts of things. Corruption seems to be everywhere in a fallen society. And that's what's mentioned here. Well, this is just human beings. You get some periods of history that are better than others, but this is deep within the human race, which justify the wicked for reward and take away the righteousness of the righteous from him. And then, once again, Isaiah points to the invasions that God will permit in verse 24, going right up to AD 70, and the loss of the privileges of the Jewish church. And there down in verse 25, and the very end of the verse, for all this, his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still. Mercy will still be extended to people who come to Christ, and the news of the Saviour will still be proclaimed. Salvation will continue. So here are the 6 great woes, and for us, the message for us is to make sure they don't penetrate our lives and steal in once again. Materialism, number 1. Number 2, immorality. Number 3, rebellion. Fancy that, dear friends. A Christian who is no longer amenable to the command of God. God says we should pay attention to something. It's in his word, and we won't. Don't let that happen to you. God's thou shalt nots, and we defy them, no better than the world. This is the characteristic of fallen mankind. Don't let it come to us. The perversion of truth, the vaunting of human wisdom above divine revelation, and the loss of integrity, the allowing of lies or excuses in our personal lives, and dishonesty and not facing. Oh, don't let these things come back. Let's keep our lives clear and the church clear. Here are the 6 great woes, the fallen characteristics of human society. And you could explore them at much greater depth. But that's enough for us this evening.